The explosion came without warning. One moment. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto was crouched in the cool darkness of the underground chamber, cleaning his Arisaka rifle by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. The next, the entire tunnel system convulsed, as if struck by the fist of an angry god. Dust and rock fragments cascaded from the ceiling. The lamp extinguished instantly, plunging everything into absolute blackness. In that darkness, Yamamoto could hear something far more terrifying than the initial blast. The groaning, cracking sound of the earth itself beginning to give way above him. It was the morning of March 9th, 1944, on the island of Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, and Private Yamamoto was about to experience something that no amount of training had prepared him for. The systematic destruction of what Imperial Japanese doctrine had promised was an impregnable fortress. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tunnel networks that riddled the Pacific Islands were not mere holes in the ground. They represented the culmination of Japanese defensive philosophy, forged through decades of military doctrine, and refined by the brutal realities of island warfare. To understand what happened to men like Yamamoto requires understanding what these underground fortifications meant to the soldiers who built and defended them, and what the Imperial Japanese Army had taught them to believe about their invincibility. Japanese military engineering had evolved significantly throughout the 1930s, particularly during the extended campaigns in China. The concept of the fortified position, the toride, was deeply embedded in Japanese military tradition, dating back to the castle fortifications of the feudal era. But the modern interpretation of underground warfare had been heavily influenced by observations of European combat in the First World War, where trench systems and underground bunkers had proven remarkably resistant to conventional artillery bombardment. Japanese military theorists had studied these lessons carefully, adapting them to the unique conditions of Pacific Island defense. By the time war erupted across the Pacific in December of 1941, Japanese military engineers had developed sophisticated tunnel construction techniques specifically designed for the volcanic and coral geology of Pacific Islands. These were not simple caves or foxholes. The tunnel complexes on islands like Bougainville, Peleliu, and later Iwo Jima were multi-level underground cities, complete with command posts, ammunition storage, hospital facilities, and interconnected defensive positions that allowed defenders to move unseen beneath the battlefield. The Imperial Japanese Army's training manuals for tunnel warfare were explicit and comprehensive. Soldiers were taught that properly constructed, underground positions provided near-total protection from naval bombardment and aerial attack. The manual issued to units deploying to the Pacific in 1943 stated that defenders in tunnel systems could survive indefinite artillery preparation, and that American forces, lacking the spiritual fortitude for prolonged combat, would be unable to dislodge determined defenders from properly prepared positions. The emphasis on spiritual strength over material advantage was not mere propaganda. It represented a fundamental assumption in Japanese military doctrine. Private Yamamoto had received this training at the Kumamoto military base in southern Japan before his deployment to the South Pacific in late 1943. He was 22 years old, a farmer's son from a small village in Kyushu, drafted into service in 1942. His training had been rigorous and comprehensive, covering everything from basic marksmanship to the specific techniques of tunnel defense. The instructors had been veterans of the China campaigns, men who spoke with authority about the effectiveness of fortified positions against numerically superior enemies. The lessons had been clear and repeatedly emphasized. Underground positions neutralized American advantages in firepower. Naval guns could crater the surface, but they could not reach defenders 30 or 40 feet below ground. Aircraft bombs were similarly ineffective against properly designed tunnel systems, with multiple chambers and blast-resistant angles. The Americans would be forced to assault these positions with infantry, and in close combat, Japanese soldiers, trained in night combat and bayonet fighting, motivated by Bushido spirit, would prove superior to the materially soft Americans. Yamamoto had believed these teachings completely. There was no reason not to. The instructors were experienced combat veterans. The engineering principles seemed sound, and the tunnel system on Bougainville, which his unit had spent 2 months constructing and improving, appeared to validate everything he had been taught. The Bougainville tunnel complex was extensive. Yamamoto's company, the 3rd Company of the 53rd Regiment of the 6th Division, had been assigned to defend a section of ridge line overlooking one of the narrow coastal plains that the Americans would need to cross to advance inland. The primary tunnel entrance was concealed in a natural ravine, screened by dense jungle vegetation. From this entrance, the main corridor extended roughly 60 feet into the hillside before branching into multiple chambers and secondary passages. The construction had been backbreaking work. The volcanic rock was hard, but could be worked with hand tools, picks, shovels, and improvised chisels. The engineers had supervised the layout, ensuring that corridors were angled to deflect blast effects and that chambers were positioned to avoid creating structural weak points. Support timbers, scavenged from the jungle, reinforced key sections. Ventilation shafts, cleverly disguised as natural features, provided air circulation. Fighting positions were constructed at strategic points, with narrow firing slits that offered protected views of approaching terrain. The result was impressive. The main chamber, where Yamamoto and 11 other soldiers were quartered, was roughly 15 feet wide and 20 feet long, with a ceiling high enough for a man to stand upright. Smaller chambers branched off for ammunition storage, medical supplies, and emergency water reserves. A separate tunnel connected to an observation post on the ridge crest, allowing defenders to monitor American movements without exposing themselves. Additional tunnels led to secondary positions, creating a network that would allow the company to shift defenders as needed, and to continue fighting even if individual positions were overrun. The psychological comfort provided by these tunnels was significant. During the American naval bombardments that began in late February of 1944, Yamamoto and his comrades had sheltered in the main chamber while the world above them erupted in violence. The sound was tremendous, a continuous rolling thunder that made normal conversation impossible. But the tunnel held. Dust filtered down from the ceiling, and occasionally a particularly close explosion would shake the timbers, but the structure remained intact. When the bombardments ended and the soldiers emerged to man their defensive positions, they found the surface transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters, but the tunnel entrances remained concealed and functional. This experience had validated their training. The tunnels worked exactly as promised. American firepower, however impressive in its volume, could not reach them underground. Yamamoto and his comrades felt confident, even somewhat contemptuous of American tactics. The Americans were expending enormous quantities of ammunition to achieve minimal actual damage. It seemed wasteful, almost desperate. Surely Japanese commanders in Tokyo had been correct in their assessment that Americans lacked the patience and tactical sophistication for extended combat against prepared defenses. The Americans landed on Bougainville on November 1st, 1943, establishing a beachhead at Cape Torokina on the western coast. The initial Japanese response had been confused and ineffective, hampered by difficult terrain and American air superiority. But by early 1944, Japanese reinforcements had arrived, and a series of counterattacks began. These attacks largely failed, suffering heavy casualties against American defensive positions and artillery. The fighting settled into a grinding pattern, with American forces gradually pushing inland against determined Japanese resistance. by March of 1944, American forces were advancing on the inland defensive positions where Yamamoto's company was dug in. The pattern of combat had become familiar. American artillery and naval gunfire would pound suspected Japanese positions for hours or even days, followed by cautious infantry advances, often supported by tanks. Japanese defenders would wait out the bombardment underground, then emerge to contest the American advance with rifle fire, machine guns, and occasional counterattacks. It was brutal, exhausting work, but the tunnel system made it survivable. What Yamamoto and his comrades did not know, could not know, based on their training and experience, was that American combat engineers and infantry units were developing and refining techniques specifically designed to neutralize tunnel defenses. These techniques did not rely on massive firepower or prolonged bombardment. Instead, they targeted the fundamental structural principles that made the tunnels seem so secure. The weapon that would shatter Yamamoto's sense of security was deceptively simple in concept: the Satchel charge. This was not a new invention. Concentrated explosive charges had been used to destroy fortifications since the advent of gunpowder. But American engineers had refined the Satchel charge into a precise instrument for tunnel warfare, and Marine and Army units had developed specific tactics for its employment against Japanese underground positions. A standard American Satchel charge consisted of multiple blocks of composition C2 explosive, a plastic explosive similar to British composition C packed into a canvas bag with a fuse assembly. The charges varied in size depending on the target, but a typical satchel for tunnel warfare contained between 15 and 20 pounds of high explosive. This was enough destructive power to collapse tunnel sections, seal entrances, or, most devastating of all, create overpressure effects that could kill defenders deep inside tunnel systems without requiring direct penetration to their positions. The key to effective use of satchel charges was not simply placing them at tunnel entrances and detonating them. Japanese engineers had designed their tunnels with angled entrances and blast deflection chambers specifically to survive such attacks. The American technique, developed through trial and costly error in earlier island campaigns, was far more sophisticated. Marine combat engineers worked in coordination with infantry assault teams. The first step was identifying tunnel entrances and ventilation shafts, a difficult task given Japanese skill at camouflage. This often required careful observation, sometimes over several days, watching for signs of human activity, air movement, or defensive fire originating from concealed positions. Once a tunnel system was identified, the next step was mapping its likely layout based on terrain features and the locations of multiple openings. The assault itself followed a careful sequence. Infantry would suppress any visible defensive positions with rifle fire and grenades, while combat engineers approached the identified openings. Rather than simply throwing charges into the entrance, engineers would position multiple charges at several points in the tunnel system simultaneously: at the main entrance, at identified ventilation shafts, and at secondary openings. These charges were placed with specific intent, not just to block passages, but to create simultaneous overpressure waves that would propagate through the tunnel system, meeting and reinforcing each other in the confined spaces underground. The physics of blast effects in confined spaces were devastating and not fully understood by Japanese defensive planners. In open air, an explosion dissipates rapidly as the pressure wave expands spherically. But in a tunnel, the pressure wave is constrained by the walls, floor, and ceiling. It cannot dissipate. Instead, it travels down the tunnel at supersonic speed, the pressure building as it funnels through constricted passages. When multiple charges detonate simultaneously at different points in a tunnel network, the pressure waves converge, creating zones of catastrophic overpressure at the intersections and chambers. The effect on human bodies in these zones was immediate and lethal. The pressure wave compressed and then rapidly decompressed the air in lungs, causing immediate pulmonary damage. Internal organs ruptured. Eardrums burst. Even soldiers not killed instantly by the direct blast effects often died from the subsequent collapse of tunnel sections, as the explosive force fractured support timbers and destabilized the ceiling and walls. Those who survived the initial blast often found themselves trapped in darkness, with passages blocked by rubble and ventilation cut off, facing slow suffocation. But on that morning in early March, Private Yamamoto knew none of this. He understood explosions in general terms. He had experienced artillery bombardment and knew the danger of grenades in combat, but he had no framework for understanding what was about to happen to his tunnel complex. The Americans had been advancing on his company's position for 2 days. The usual pattern had held: heavy bombardment, followed by cautious infantry movement. Yamamoto's unit had successfully defended against 2 probing attacks, inflicting casualties and forcing the Americans to withdraw. The company commander, Captain Oshima, had been pleased. The tunnels were working as designed. American casualties were mounting while Japanese losses remained light. It seemed possible that the Americans might abandon this axis of advance and seek an easier route. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On the evening of March 8th, Captain Oshima had gathered the section leaders in the main chamber for a briefing. The Americans had been quiet all afternoon, which was unusual. Oshima speculated that they might be preparing for a major attack at dawn. He ordered half the company to remain on alert in the fighting positions while the other half rested in the tunnels. Ammunition and grenades were distributed. The machine gun position covering the main approach was reinforced with extra barrels and belts. Everything seemed in order. Yamamoto was part of the rest rotation. He had been on the firing line since before dawn, and the company sergeant had ordered him back to the main chamber to eat and clean his weapon. The rifle's action had become gritty with volcanic dust, and proper maintenance was essential. He had settled into his usual spot in the chamber near one of the support posts, and had just begun disassembling the bolt mechanism when the first explosion came. The blast was not like artillery fire. Artillery created a sharp crack followed by the whistle of fragments. This was different. A deep, crushing thump that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The pressure change was immediate and physically painful. Yamamoto felt his ears pop violently. The kerosene lamp blew out as if struck by a great wind. The darkness was total and disorienting. For several seconds there was confused shouting. Then came the second series of explosions, and with them the sound that would haunt Yamamoto for the rest of his life, the groaning, splintering crack of the tunnel structure beginning to fail. Somewhere in the darkness, one of the support timbers snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. A section of ceiling collapsed and Yamamoto heard screaming. Short, cut off abruptly as tons of rock and earth came down. The instinct for survival overrode everything else. Yamamoto scrambled away from the sound of the collapse, hands outstretched in the absolute darkness, feeling for the tunnel wall. His fingers found rough volcanic rock, and he pressed himself against it, making himself as small as possible. Around him he could hear others doing the same. Ragged breathing, whispered prayers, the scraping of boots on stone. Then came the third wave of explosions, and this time Yamamoto understood with terrible clarity what was happening. The Americans were not trying to break into the tunnel. They were trying to destroy it entirely, to bury everyone inside alive. The pressure waves from this third detonation were even more severe. Yamamoto felt something wet running from his ears. Blood, he realized distantly. His chest felt constricted, as if a great weight was pressing on it. The air itself seemed wrong, thick and hard to breathe. More sections of ceiling were coming down now, not in catastrophic collapses, but in steady, inexorable settling. The mountain itself was folding in on the hollow spaces that men had carved into it. Someone nearby was calling for Captain Oshima. The voice was young, panicked. There was no answer. In the darkness, Yamamoto could not tell how many of his comrades remained alive in the chamber, how many were buried under the cave-ins, how many had been killed by the blast effects themselves. He tried to call out, but his voice emerged as a croak. His throat was raw, his lungs aching with each breath. Time became impossible to measure. It might have been minutes or hours before someone managed to light a match. The flickering flame revealed a scene of devastation. The main chamber, which had seemed so solid and secure, was now a partially collapsed ruin. The ceiling had come down across roughly half the space, creating a slope of broken rock that completely buried the area where the ammunition had been stored. Of the 12 men who had been resting in the chamber, Yamamoto could see only 6 others in the matchlight, all of them dust-covered and bleeding from ears and noses. Captain Oshima was not among them. The match burned down and went out. In the renewed darkness, someone suggested they try to dig toward the main entrance to escape before the entire tunnel system collapsed. But when they felt their way to where the entrance corridor should have been, they found only solid rubble. The Americans had sealed it completely. The ventilation shafts, there should have been 2 in this section, were also blocked. The air was already beginning to feel stale. For men trained to believe that tunnel systems were impregnable fortresses, this rapid transformation into a tomb was psychologically devastating. The doctrine that had been drilled into them, the assurances from engineers and officers, the confidence built through surviving earlier bombardments, all of it was revealed as inadequate in the face of this new American tactic. The tunnels had not failed because they were poorly constructed. They had failed because the Americans had found a way to turn the tunnel's own structure against the defenders, using the confined spaces that were supposed to provide protection to amplify destructive force instead. Private Yamamoto would later learn, during his time as a prisoner of war, that the technique the Americans had used that morning was the result of systematic development across multiple island campaigns. On Guadalcanal in 1942 and early 1943, American forces had initially struggled to deal with Japanese cave and tunnel positions. Standard infantry weapons were largely ineffective, and attempts to destroy positions with artillery or naval gunfire often failed due to the protection offered by earth and rock. Flamethrowers proved useful at tunnel entrances but could not reach deep into complex systems. By the time American forces assaulted Tarawa in November of 1943, combat engineers had begun experimenting with concentrated explosive charges specifically designed for fortification destruction. The brutal fighting on Tarawa, where Japanese defenders in concrete bunkers and underground positions inflicted severe casualties on the attacking Marines, accelerated the development of these techniques. Engineers discovered that placing charges at multiple points in a defensive structure and detonating them simultaneously created far more damage than single large explosions. The overpressure effects in confined spaces were particularly devastating. These lessons were refined further during the Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944, where Japanese defenders on Kwajalein and Eniwetok had constructed elaborate tunnel systems similar to those on Bougainville. American assault teams developed standard procedures: identify all openings to a tunnel system, insert smoke grenades to map airflow and connections between passages, position satchel charges at key points, and detonate simultaneously. The procedure was dangerous for the engineers who had to approach enemy positions under fire, but it was brutally effective at neutralizing tunnel defenses. What made the technique particularly devastating was that it required relatively small amounts of explosive compared to conventional bombardment. A naval battleship might fire hundreds of 14-inch shells at a ridgeline, cratering the surface but leaving deep tunnels intact. A combat engineer team with 30 pounds of composition C2, properly placed, could collapse the same tunnel system in seconds. The efficiency was striking, and for Japanese defenders who had been taught to trust in underground fortifications, the psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. But in the collapsed darkness of the Bougainville tunnel on that March morning, Yamamoto knew none of this technical detail. He knew only that the world had inverted. The tunnel that was supposed to protect him had become a trap. The solid earth that should have shielded him from American firepower was now crushing the life from him and his comrades. And the Americans, whom Japanese doctrine had taught were tactically inferior, dependent on material superiority rather than tactical skill, had demonstrated a level of methodical, engineering-based lethality that exceeded anything in Yamamoto's experience. The survivors in the collapsed chamber made a decision. They would try to dig their way to one of the secondary passages, which might still be intact and might lead to other sections of the tunnel complex or to the surface. Using their hands, bayonets, and entrenching tools, anything they could find in the darkness, they began to clear rubble from what they believed was the direction of a connecting tunnel. The work was exhausting and terrifying. The air continued to worsen. Each breath seemed to provide less oxygen than the one before. The diggers worked in shifts, 2 men at a time, scraping away rocks and earth while the others rested and tried to conserve air. There was almost no conversation. Speech required breath they could not spare. The only sounds were the scraping of metal on stone, the clatter of falling rocks, and the increasingly labored breathing of men slowly suffocating. After what seemed like hours, though Yamamoto's sense of time had become completely unreliable, they broke through into a secondary passage. The air that flowed through the opening was only marginally better than what they had been breathing, but it was enough to provide hope. One by one, the survivors squeezed through the gap they had created and into the passage beyond. This corridor was damaged, but not completely collapsed. The ceiling had fractured and sagged in places, and there were spots where they had to crawl over piles of debris, but it was passable. They moved slowly, feeling their way in the darkness, heading in what they hoped was the direction of another exit, or at least a section of tunnel that might still have ventilation. They found bodies. The first was one of their comrades from the company, crushed under a ceiling collapse. Then another, and another. Some showed no visible injuries. These men had died from the blast overpressure itself, their internal organs ruptured by the pressure waves. The survivors moved past these bodies without comment. There was nothing to be said, nothing to be done. Survival required forward movement. Eventually they saw light, faint, filtering through cracks in a blocked passage. They dug toward it frantically, no longer trying to conserve energy or breath. The light meant access to the surface, to air, to escape from this stone coffin. The rocks came away more easily here, and within minutes they had created an opening large enough to crawl through. Yamamoto emerged into devastated jungle. The morning light was blinding after the hours of darkness. He lay on the ground, gasping, his lungs straining to process the fresh air. Around him, the other survivors were doing the same. Of the 12 men who had been in the main chamber, only 5 had made it out alive. Of the entire company of nearly 120 men, Yamamoto would later learn, fewer than 30 survived the tunnel collapses. But escape from the tunnel did not mean safety. They were still in the middle of a combat zone, and American forces were advancing through the area. The survivors had no weapons. These had been left behind in the collapsed tunnel, and no clear sense of where friendly Japanese lines might be. They were isolated, disoriented, and psychologically shattered. Over the following 3 days, Yamamoto and 2 other survivors from his section moved through the jungle, trying to avoid American patrols and locate Japanese units. They found evidence of more collapsed tunnel systems, craters where tunnel entrances had been, fresh earth and splintered timbers marking the sites of destroyed positions. The entire defensive line had been systematically dismantled. On the 4th day, exhausted and on the edge of starvation, they encountered an American patrol. There was a brief moment when Yamamoto considered fighting or running or somehow resisting, but he was unarmed, weakened, and surrounded. The Americans took them prisoner without incident. Yamamoto's war was over. The prisoner of war camp on Bougainville, and later at a larger facility in New Caledonia, was where Yamamoto's understanding of the war began a more profound transformation. The physical trauma of the tunnel collapse was severe. He had sustained hearing damage that would never fully heal, and he suffered from nightmares about being buried alive that persisted for years. But the psychological adjustment was in some ways more difficult. In the POW camp, Yamamoto was exposed to information that fundamentally contradicted what he had been taught about the war. American guards, and more importantly, interrogators and the camp administration, were not particularly interested in maintaining Japanese propaganda narratives. Newspapers and radio broadcasts, carefully monitored but not entirely censored, provided information about the broader progress of the war. The news was devastating for Japanese prisoners to absorb. Yamamoto learned that the tunnel systems that had seemed so formidable, the defensive networks on Bougainville, on other Solomon Islands across the Pacific, were being systematically reduced by American forces. The techniques used on his position were not unique or experimental. They were standard procedure, refined and improved with each campaign. What he had experienced as a shocking, unprecedented attack was, to American combat engineers, routine work. The scale of American material production was another revelation that contradicted Japanese wartime propaganda. Prisoners could see this directly in the POW camps. The food rations provided to prisoners, while not luxurious, were more substantial and varied than what Yamamoto had received as an active Japanese soldier. The camps had electric lighting, running water, and medical facilities that exceeded what was available to frontline Japanese troops. Guards wore uniforms that appeared to be mass-produced to consistent quality standards, carried weapons that showed sophisticated manufacturing, and seemed to have unlimited access to supplies. This casual abundance stood in stark contrast to the increasing desperation that had characterized Yamamoto's final months in the Japanese military. By early 1944, supply lines to forward Pacific positions were already severely strained. Rations were reduced. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Equipment repairs were improvised with whatever materials could be scavenged. The tunnels on Bougainville had been dug primarily with hand tools, not because this was preferred, but because mechanical equipment was unavailable. American prisoners, in contrast, described situations where equipment was so abundant that damaged items were sometimes discarded rather than repaired. Yamamoto heard accounts, initially dismissed as propaganda, then gradually accepted as likely true, of American supply ships that carried ice cream-making equipment, of forward airfields that received hot meals flown in daily, of tanks and trucks that were replaced rather than repaired when they developed mechanical problems. The scale of resource availability was beyond anything in his experience. The interrogators were particularly interested in what Japanese soldiers had been taught about American fighting capabilities and industrial capacity. Yamamoto, along with other prisoners, described the training they had received, the emphasis on spiritual strength over material advantage, the assurances that American soldiers were soft and lacked commitment, The claims that American industrial production was exaggerated propaganda. The interrogators listened with what seemed like genuine interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but offering few comments. It was only gradually, through conversations with other prisoners, and through careful attention to information that filtered into the camp, that Yamamoto began to understand the true scope of the disparity. The tunnels that were supposed to be impregnable had proven vulnerable to relatively simple engineering solutions. The spiritual strength that was supposed to compensate for material disadvantage had proven insufficient when the material disadvantage was measured in orders of magnitude. The Americans, whom Japanese doctrine characterized as tactically inferior, had demonstrated methodical, effective approaches to every defensive technique the Japanese deployed. By late 1944, as news of American advances across the Pacific reached the POW camps, Yamamoto was forced to confront a reality that invalidated much of what he had believed. The war was not proceeding as Japanese propaganda had promised. The tunnel systems that were supposed to make islands into unsinkable fortresses were being reduced one after another. The American advance was not slowing or stalling. It was accelerating. The spiritual strength and tactical brilliance that were supposed to compensate for material disadvantage were proving insufficient against an enemy that possessed both material superiority and tactical competence. The technique that had destroyed Yamamoto's tunnel on Bougainville was replicated and refined across subsequent Pacific campaigns. On Peleliu, in September and October of 1944, American forces faced perhaps the most sophisticated Japanese tunnel defenses of the war. The island's coral limestone geology allowed for extensive cave systems, and Japanese engineers had created a defensive network of staggering complexity. American casualties were severe, but the satchel charge technique, combined with flamethrowers and direct assault tactics, eventually reduced even these formidable positions. On Iwo Jima, in February and March of 1945, Japanese defenders constructed tunnel networks even more extensive than those on Peleliu, 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, some extending 40 feet below the surface, with multiple levels and hundreds of chambers. American Marines suffered nearly 26,000 casualties taking the Oi Island, but the tunnels, despite their sophistication, ultimately failed to prevent American victory. Combat engineers systematically sealed tunnel entrances, destroyed ventilation systems, and collapsed entire sections using the techniques refined over previous campaigns. The final and most devastating demonstration came on Okinawa from April through June of 1945. Japanese defenders had constructed massive tunnel complexes in the island's limestone ridges, some of which housed entire battalion headquarters with hospital facilities, communication centers, and supply depots. American forces faced months of brutal fighting, but the outcome was never in doubt. The techniques for reducing tunnel defenses had been perfected. Satchel charges, flamethrowers, bulldozers to seal entrances, and systematic mapping of tunnel systems allowed American forces to methodically eliminate Japanese positions. What Japanese doctrine had failed to account for was the American capacity for systematic analysis and tactical adaptation. Each campaign provided lessons that were documented, analyzed, and incorporated into training and tactical manuals for subsequent operations. The tunnel destruction techniques used on Bougainville in March of 1944 were improved for Peleliu in September, refined further for Iwo Jima in February of 1945, and perfected for Okinawa in April. American forces demonstrated not just material superiority but institutional learning capacity, the ability to identify problems, develop solutions, distribute those solutions across the force, and execute them effectively. For Yamamoto, sitting in a POW camp as the war ground toward its conclusion, the implications were profound and personally devastating. The tunnel that was supposed to protect him had nearly killed him. The training that was supposed to prepare him for combat had left him unprepared for the reality of American tactical competence. The doctrine that promised ultimate victory through spiritual superiority had proven to be a fantasy maintained in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence. The news of Japan's surrender in August of 1945 reached the POW camps with mixed reactions. Some prisoners refused to believe it, insisting it must be American propaganda. Others accepted it with a sense of relief that the dying could finally stop. Yamamoto felt primarily numbness. The war was over, but what had it been for? What had been accomplished by the deaths of so many of his comrades, buried in collapsed tunnels across the Pacific, or killed in futile banzai charges, or starved to death in bypassed garrisons? The repatriation process was slow. Yamamoto did not return to Japan until early 1946. The country he returned to was devastated. Cities burned, the population traumatized and starving. The entire social and political structure that had sent him to war, now discredited and dismantled. His family's farm in Kyushu had survived, but his father had died during the war, and his younger brother had been killed during the American bombing of Nagasaki. The village he remembered from his youth was filled with widows and orphans. In the decades that followed, Yamamoto rarely spoke about his war experiences. The trauma of the tunnel collapse remained with him. He could not enter enclosed spaces without anxiety, and thunderstorms would sometimes trigger panic attacks that took him back to that morning on Bougainville when the earth itself had seemed to be trying to crush the life from him. But more than the physical trauma, he carried the weight of understanding how thoroughly he had been deceived, how completely the doctrine he had trusted had failed to prepare him for reality. In his later years, Yamamoto occasionally gave interviews to historians researching the Pacific War. He described the tunnel defenses on Bougainville, the training he had received, and the terrible morning when the Americans had demonstrated the inadequacy of those defenses. He spoke carefully, without bitterness or melodrama, simply describing what had happened and what he had believed at the time. He emphasized particularly the gap between what Japanese soldiers had been taught to expect and what they actually encountered, a gap that had cost tens of thousands of lives. The satchel charge technique that had destroyed Yamamoto's tunnel was, in the end, a relatively minor tactical innovation in the context of the entire Pacific War. It did not change the fundamental trajectory of the conflict, which was determined by larger strategic factors: American industrial capacity, control of sea lanes, air superiority, and the progressive isolation of Japanese garrisons. But for individual soldiers like Yamamoto, trapped in darkness as the earth collapsed around them, it represented something more significant: the moment when doctrine collided with reality, when the promises of invulnerability met the practical application of enemy engineering, and when the comforting narratives of spiritual superiority confronted the brutal physics of high explosives in confined spaces. The tunnel networks that riddled Pacific Islands were never the impregnable fortresses that Japanese doctrine had promised. They were, instead, elaborate tombs for thousands of soldiers who had been taught to trust in them. The Americans who developed and refined the techniques for destroying these tunnels were not demonstrating tactical genius. They were simply applying engineering principles and learning from experience, adapting their methods to overcome each new defensive challenge they encountered. But to Japanese defenders who had staked their lives on the promised invulnerability of underground positions, each collapsed tunnel was a revelation of how comprehensively their understanding of the war had been shaped by comforting fictions rather than hard realities. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto survived the war, lived to see Japan's reconstruction and transformation into a peaceful democracy, and died in 1998 at the age of 76. In his final years, He expressed gratitude that younger generations of Japanese would not have to experience what he had experienced. Not just the physical trauma of combat, but the psychological devastation of discovering that everything you had been taught to believe, everything you had trusted your life to, was inadequate in the face of an enemy who approached war as a problem to be solved through systematic analysis and practical application of resources. The legacy of tunnel warfare in the Pacific remains visible today. On islands like Peleliu and Iwo Jima, tourists can visit some of the surviving tunnel systems, walking through passages where desperate battles were fought 8 decades ago. The collapsed sections, the sealed entrances, the craters where Satchel charges once detonated. These remain as testament to a particular kind of combat, and to the limits of defensive engineering when faced with determined assault forces equipped with effective counter techniques. But perhaps the deeper legacy is the lesson that Yamamoto and thousands of soldiers like him learned at such terrible cost. That doctrine unsupported by reality, that confidence ungrounded in accurate assessment of relative capabilities, that faith in spiritual superiority as compensation for material disadvantage, these are not foundations for victory. They are comfortable fictions that dissolve when confronted with the hard facts of physics, engineering, and the systematic application of overwhelming resources. The morning of March 9, 1944, when the tunnel walls began to crack and the darkness filled with dust and the screams of dying men, was the moment when one soldier's understanding of the war shattered as completely as the volcanic rock that had promised to protect him. Everything after, the desperate escape, the years in POW camps, the slow reconstruction of a life in defeated Japan, flowed from that moment of terrible clarity when the earth itself seemed to betray him, and he understood that he had trusted his life to promises that could not withstand the methodical violence of an enemy who had learned to turn his fortress into his tomb. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.